Welcome to From the Honeycomb podcast. I am your host, Katerina. Join me as we explore stories of fearless female entrepreneurs and inspiring women in architecture, construction, engineering, and beyond. Each episode is a captivating blend of topics that resonate with the soul. Whether you're here to learn more about entrepreneurship, architecture, holistic living, or just need a little extra inspiration, you've come to the right place. So sit back, relax, and let the buzz of positive energy spark your curiosity. Welcome to the third anniversary episode of From the Honeycomb podcast. I cannot believe it's already been 3 years. Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to share today. A little update on what it's been like having a podcast for, coming on to 3 years. And I also want to share what's coming up for the future of From the Honeycomb podcast, because I've taken the last few months to really look at where do I want the future of the podcast to go. So I'm really excited for this episode. So please raise a glass to 3 years of From the Honeycomb podcast. Now, as you all know by now, I like to start every episode by sharing something that I am grateful for or my guest is grateful for in the present moment. And one of the behind the scenes aspect of that I kind of want to share in today's episode too, because it is really all about the podcast, is when I was creating the format of what I wanted the podcast to be, I knew there was something at the beginning. And I took a little bit of a course to figure out, how to set up a podcast and all that. And in the course, we talked about there's something at the beginning of an episode that's a little something, short to get to know the guest or the person or something. I know some people do rapid fire. Some people do like good week, bad week. That's the Lady Gang. I listen to that podcast. They do kind of that. So I knew there was always something I wanted to have. And I wanted the podcast to start off in a positive way as well. And I know gratitude is something that is very positive and it creates like this positive energy, which is something I wanted to bring in. I also, around this time, started practicing gratitude and I was going through my architecture exams and things were really hard. I was like, I want to be able to start off the podcast with something positive. And so that's kind of how and why we do gratitude at the beginning of every episode. And also, I think it's a way for guests. I was just talking to a friend about this, I think it's a way for guests, especially if it's their first time on a podcast, to be able to kind of get into the episode by sharing something that is positive. And I think it also helps kind of calm the nerves before we dive into the episode of whatever the topic is, whatever I'm interviewing them about. I think it kind of is also kind of a way for us to connect a little bit. I like to connect with whoever, is sharing what they're grateful for. I like to chime in and be like, oh, well, here's what I think about that. I know maybe this was a year ago, I used to also share with the guests what I'm grateful for, and then it just seemed like it was too long. So now I've kind of shifted that format. And that's something I think the podcast is ever evolving, ever growing, especially when it comes to trends and things like that, which I want to dive into later on in the episode. So that's just kind of why are we even doing gratitude at the beginning of every episode? And I don't know if I've even shared that before in the past. So for me, what I am grateful for in this present moment is just thinking about this podcast. And I am really grateful for all of the guests throughout the years that I have had, because really without them, it would just be me and my microphone, which it was at the beginning until I kind of got the confidence enough to ask guests to come on. Now I'm actually I think in the last few months, really, people have been reaching out to me to have guests on, whether it's either like managers, assistants have been asking to have certain people on the podcast, which I always get those emails and I'm like, how did you find my podcast? And it's really interesting. Some of the people that have, and I guess even from when I first started the podcast, I would get those emails here and there like, hey, we see you have a podcast. We think so-and-so would be really great for it. Most of those at the beginning were definitely not fits, where I'm like, I don't even think, have you listened to my podcast? Like this guest would not even make sense on it. But now it's definitely become more specific to, what the podcast is and the theme, which I also want to get later on into the episode, because obviously From the Honeycomb is pivoting into a different kind of category and theme as well. And so, but we'll get to that later on in the episode. I feel like I'm jumping ahead so much. But anyway, so what I'm really grateful for is all of the guests, everyone who has taken the time to sit down with me, record, late in the evening or on a weekend. I know back when I was still working my 9 to 5, I always had to record on the weekends. So I'm really grateful for everybody who made that availability possible to be able to record with me on the weekend. Obviously, now that I work for myself and work from home, my schedule is, a lot more fluid. So I'm able to, record with guests in multiple different times that work for me and also work for them. And so, yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody who has been on the From the Honeycomb podcast and for taking the time really to come share your story, share it with me, share it with the listeners, because I have learned so much on so many different topics throughout the years, and I am just really, really grateful to each and every one of you. Hi, it's me, Katerina. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to share with you something that can change the trajectory of your life. If you are ready to start your own architecture firm but are feeling overwhelmed by where to begin, I understand, because I felt the same way when I first embarked on my entrepreneurial journey. This is why I have created the ebook, The Mindful Blueprint for Launching Your Architecture Firm. This comprehensive workbook contains everything I wish I had known before starting my own firm. From building a solid business plan to creating your brand, the Mindful Blueprint for Launching Your Architecture Firm offers a step-by-step guide tailored to your timeline, whether you're launching your firm today, next month, or in a few years. Dive into essential topics like financial planning, organization strategies, and how to secure your first client, all in one convenient resource. That's right, you don't have to spend hours researching. I have done that for you so you can focus on building your business. And that's not all. With your purchase, you'll also receive an exclusive meditation for business owners, mindfulness tips, a crystal guide for support, and gratitude exercises to help you stay focused and positive throughout your journey. Turn your dream of having your own firm into a reality with the Mindful Blueprint for Launching Your Architecture Firm. Click on the link in the show notes to get your copy today. Now, let's dive into the episode. So I feel like in the gratitude part, I started to kind of tease what's coming up on the episode. And I also want to make sure that I cover everything that I mentioned. But let's just take a moment to just celebrate that it's going to be 3 years of From the Honeycomb podcast. When I first started this podcast, I didn't know what kind of direction it was going to go into. I've shared it on multiple podcasts that I've been on, and I've kind of shared it on here, is I didn't really market it or tell anybody when I first started it. And literally all of my listens were like family and friends. And I'd be like, oh, can you please listen to my podcast? And I didn't market it at all. And it wasn't until I really had my first guest, which was almost 5 or 6 months into having the podcast, which was my friend Stephanie. She came on. I went up to LA to record at her partner's house because he had recording stuff ready, podcast recording. So we could do 2 microphones, and I brought mine and she had hers, and it was kind of cool. And we thought we could do video, but I didn't have any video set up back then. And so that's really once I started feeling confident. And I know that some of the first guests I had on were friends or people I knew through Rose Gold Goddesses, which is this online platform created by Sahara Rose. And so that's where I was finding people. And then now finding guests, that's evolved into people on Instagram, people I meet in real life now at conferences, things like that. And I'm always kind of looking for people I'm interested in learning more about and just kind of getting to know more, and just different various topics. I know just even within this last year, there's been a lot more, women in architecture on, but also I know last summer I had the marine biologist on and Alana. And then I also had Tara, who's an astrologer. I've had on coaches. I've had on, just so many different people, really mostly women, focusing of course on women. I have had 2 men on this year, and I'm very selective when it comes to males on the podcast because I do want to really connect with like-minded women. Obviously, that's in the intro, which, oh my gosh, we didn't even talk about. The intro to the podcast has changed, if you did not notice at the beginning of the episode. So if you haven't been a longtime listener, you know that at the beginning of every episode, there's the intro, obviously. I don't know where I was going with that. But what I want to say is, if you've been a longtime listener of the podcast, then you have noticed that every anniversary, the intro changes. So of course, with the 3-year anniversary, the intro is changing because the podcast is changing. And so that's something I also want to talk about is the podcast theme is pivoting. When I first started it, it was all about Vastu Shastra, which I have enjoyed learning about Vastu so much. I have been able to learn about it through doing research for the podcast, and then for having even my Vastu coach on, Vastu expert, Savi, she was on earlier this year. And which any episode I talk about in this episode, I'll provide a link in the show notes if you want to check it out. So Vastu, but really the last podcast episode I've had about Vastu was when I had Savi on, and I think that was back in February of this year, so February of 2024, and this is coming out in September of 2024. So really, I have pivoted away from Vastu. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, back in June, I have shared that I'm no longer providing Vastu consultations. I'm not going to get into it here in this episode. I'll provide a link in the show notes if you want to listen to my entrepreneurship update. That kind of talks about why I'm pivoting away from Vastu from my business. But that also means the theme of the podcast isn't Vastu anymore. And one of the things that also kind of changed that, which I want to talk about, is trends. One of the trends now, and it's been well over a year and a half, I don't know, maybe it was 2 years ago, when video became very popular, to be able to post a recording of podcast episodes, right? So when I started the podcasting world and started to understand what is, it take to have a podcast, video was not an aspect of that, thankfully. I don't think I would have started a podcast now had I known all about the video aspect of it. Obviously, I have evolved, I've grown. I now, I've also, at first I was like, oh my gosh, everything has to look perfect. My hair, my makeup, every outfit's different. Honestly, right now I'm sitting in the t-shirt I've been sitting in all day at home. I think this wasn't my pajama shirt. So just to give you an aspect of yes, I still kind of do the lights and, put on a little makeup and try to look presentable because I do know this is going on the internet. But I also recognize that, and I think I did a poll about this, who actually notices my outfits in the podcast episodes? And a majority of you said you don't even notice. So I used to think so much about, should I, the clothing should be in relationship to the theme of the podcast, all of that. I don't do that anymore, really. Honestly, right now, I'm just whatever is most comfortable. Also, because it is super hot outside, I just closed all the windows for the audio, and I don't have the air conditioning on everything, so I don't have the sound. So honestly, for me, it's whatever's comfortable, and I don't mind sweating a little in. So full disclosure there. Anyway, so that was the thing with video coming into, the podcast world, is one of the reasons I started to pivot away from Vastu, because most of my earlier Vastu episodes were very heavily researched. And so really, I would actually read from the notes that I had taken. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I'm reading the notes, I won't be able to look into the camera. Do I need to memorize this? And it just became too much. And that kind of planted the seed for me to pivot away from Vastu. So that's kind of why that's happened. Now, the theme that you've been noticing in the last few months of where the podcast is going is it's going in the entrepreneurship path, right? The entrepreneurship category, because in the business category, I'm having more business owners on, not only just in architecture, but in different businesses, because it's really interesting to me how small business owners do it, especially now in the world of social media and getting brands out there and getting, merchandise out there and products and product launches. That is just so fascinating to me. Also, I think because I never took any business class or marketing class, it's really interesting for me to learn from other like-minded women, especially women who create products that I like to, to purchase, or that, interest me very much. So things like that. So as you've noticed, the podcast is shifting into the entrepreneurship world, and it has just been so fascinating for me to connect with other like-minded women, architecturally, entrepreneurship-wise, and just really, that's the direction the podcast is going. I don't think in the future you'll be seeing any more Vastu episodes unless I have a Vastu expert come on or something like that. But moving forward, unfortunately, the Vastu, episodes of the podcast will no longer be produced. Of course, all my previous content will still be out there. So if you are interested in listening to Vastu, go back, listen to the episodes. They'll always be there. But I am kind of shifting the direction I want to go with the podcast. And so with that is, what is the future of From the Honeycomb podcast going to look like now that I have, shifted my interests about the podcast and the things that I want to learn about, and the kind of guests I want to have on the podcast as well. So the last few months, I've really taken a time to reflect on my business, on my podcast, on a lot of things of what have I learned in this last year of working for myself, what are things that have worked for me, not worked for me. Those are systems in my business and also systems with the podcast. Again, if you want to know about my business, I'll provide a link in the show notes for my entrepreneurship episode. But with the podcast, things have been changing as far as how much content I want to put out there. And I kind of hit a little bit of a stage of burnout the last few months of getting content out every single week. That includes show notes. That includes the podcast. And remember, I don't even edit my own podcast. I have a podcast editor. So it's also getting the videos out, all of that. And I do most of the clips and the videos, and I make notes about how to edit the podcast episode, and I send that to my editor, all of that. But it still takes a lot of time. And I played with the idea of, should I get a social media manager to help with the podcast and all of that? And I did get some quotes and pricing, and just it wasn't in my budget in the moment to be able to have a person come on, because when I looked at it in the grand scheme of things on how much time it really takes me, it's not that much for me to be able to pay someone to do the work that I could do. And I have systems in place, and things do take, they're pretty efficient. I would like to say I'm very proud of, how I put together my posts. Everything's in a template. Like, I kind of just have things going already. In the future, am I open to having someone help me? Absolutely. But I also started to think about, what did I want to do with the future of this podcast? So starting in January of 2025, there is going to be a new format. What that format is specifically, I can't share just yet. I'm putting the finishing touches to it right now on what do I think is going to be able to work for me. So the podcast isn't going away. It's definitely not going away. It is going to change. At least, I don't know what I can tease, because I also don't want to share something and then be like, well, actually I changed my mind, because I'm still kind of marinating in the idea of what it is. I feel confident. I've slept on it. I've journaled about it. I've talked to my coach about it. I'm like, okay, I think I know what I want the podcast to be and the direction it's going to go in. But I still want to sit with it for a few more weeks. So up until the end of December of 2024, there will still be a podcast every Friday, except, of course, the last 2 weeks of December, because it's Christmas holiday. And then I usually don't post an episode the week of Thanksgiving in the United States. A few times, I think the first year maybe I had a podcast episode, Thanksgiving, possibly the year after that. But last year, I just didn't feel like a lot of people were listening to the podcast episode, and especially because a lot of my listeners are US based. So I just take Thanksgiving week off. So for any of my international listeners, Thanksgiving is usually the last Thursday of every November. So whatever the last Friday is of every November, there just won't be an episode. So that's that. That's the schedule for the rest of the year. I have pretty much all of my guest spots filled. I do have like 1 or 2 floating episodes that I don't know if I'm going to do with myself or with another guest or something. I do keep a few in the schedule, just possibilities of what I want to fill the episode with, or something comes up, like a trip or something. I also recognize that my husband Jesse hasn't been on the podcast in a long time, and that also has to do with video. So just to kind of go back to talking about, how did the video format change my podcasting? I used to have Jesse on often, like we would record, and that was before we needed a camera. And there's been a few where we've recorded on the couch, but I just never like how that looks on the camera. And I know I only post it for those few clips on Instagram. Like, I don't have a YouTube. Have I thought about starting a YouTube account? Absolutely. At the moment, I just don't have the bandwidth. Yes, I could hire someone to do it. Yes, it's possible it could be done quickly. Like, I use Riverside, which makes it pretty quick for me to be able to do that. I just don't really, honestly, I just don't watch YouTube very often unless I need to like watch a instruction video about something. And it's usually an instruction video on or a construction video where I'm like, I don't know exactly what this means. So I'll like watch a YouTube video, or I take yoga classes or workout classes on YouTube. So I just haven't really been interested in getting on YouTube. I know a lot of podcasters have that, just not really something I was interested in. Definitely thought about it for a while, also got some pricing about it, and just was like, no, I'm good. I think I'm okay with just being on, streaming platforms for podcasts. So that is pretty much it that I can think of about the podcast. The future, I feel like there was something else I wanted to share, and now I can't remember it. I should have taken notes. Oh, I remember. Usually on this episode, I like to share where are listeners listening to the podcast. So, with that being said, let me pull up my statistics and let you know where in the last year, so last 12 months, I like to say let's do the top 4 countries. of where I had the top downloads for From the Honeycomb podcast. So, no surprise, in first place is the United States, which I believe, oh man, I should have compared before what was last year. But I think this year is definitely new because I see a country in third place that I don't remember being there. Oh yeah, definitely. So, first country, the most popular downloads is obviously the United States. In second place, Canada. And for the first time, I just noticed this. These are just this last year, not overall in the entire time of having From the Honeycomb, but just within this last year. In third place is Germany, actually, which surprises me. I think it was the UK last year, and then it was India the first year or something like that. So interesting that Germany is now in third place. So vielen Dank für, oh my gosh, what is listening? I took German in high school and I've been doing Duolingo with my German, and I cannot think of how do you say thank you for listening. What is listening? Oh my gosh. Anyway, vielen Dank. And I'm so happy that you are downloading the podcast episodes in Germany. And then in fourth place, the UK, followed by India. So really interesting to see who's been interested. I actually haven't checked in on this whole year. So that is really interesting. Also, my downloads have gone up. There's been a huge increase in podcast listening. So also want to say thank you so much to everybody who tunes in every week. If you're new here, welcome. I'm just really excited to have you here and be on this journey. And then I guess, what do I always share? Oh, I think I share the top downloaded episodes. So why don't we look into that? So in this last year, the top downloaded episode was actually at the end of last year. It was looking back on 2023 in Betty's rearview mirror. That's when Jesse and I sat down to talk about what was 2023 like for us. So that had an immense amount of downloads. And then in second place is Architecting Motherhood with Balance and Boundaries with licensed architect Morgan Chihuahua, which that episode has done really well. This was obviously the episodes that are doing really well are probably usually my January, February episodes. There's definitely that dip you notice in the holidays. I don't know if any other podcasters notice that. That's another reason I took December off from podcasting, is because I do notice that there is just a dip in listening. Even I personally don't listen to podcasts as much around the holidays. I think because I mostly have Christmas music playing when I'm driving and stuff, so I just don't really think about listening to podcasts. So that's probably why I think January, February are really my top downloaded times so far. So December, January, and because obviously there's been more time for people to be able to download this episode. And then in third place is Breaking Ground Together, From Friendship to a Female Powerhouse with the Female Contractors. That episode aired in January. That was also a really good episode that I really enjoyed recording that episode, because actually I think that's the first episode of 2024 with MJ and Gigi from Pathway Construction. So that was a really great episode. Super excited to see that that's in third place. And let's see. Yeah, I guess the fourth episode is the transformative power of Vastu in architectural design with architect and Vastu expert Savi. So obviously that was my Vastu coach, Vastu instructor. Yeah, I took one of her courses last summer, so I had her on. So that was really great. Obviously, a lot of you listened to that episode. It was really interesting having Savi on talking about Vastu. She's definitely that Vastu expert. So those were the top 4 episodes. I'm trying to think. I'm looking at my little dashboard to see what else I can share with you. I use Podbean, by the way, if anybody's interested. Oh, I do States. Podbean is, by the way, if you aren't in the podcast world, Podbean is how I distribute podcast episodes. So there's different platforms. I know Spotify has their own thing. I use Podbean, which means when I post an episode, so I'll upload the file, I'll put in the show notes, all of that, do the length, note it if it's explicit or not. I've started noting all of them as explicit because I tried to understand when I first started the podcast what triggers an explicit episode. And then I think one day I said hell, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is that going to trigger it? Because then you can have the episode possibly taken down and there's all this other stuff that goes with it. So just to be safe and so nobody gets offended by anything, even though I'm pretty PG-13 rated. I don't think, sometimes I'll cuss, but not really. I just wanted to be covered. So I just put explicit on everything, although most of my episodes aren't explicit. It's just you never know these days. So that's right. The most downloaded states in the United States. Really fun to do. So in first place, as always, is California. And then second place is Virginia. And third place is Florida. And fourth place, I'll just share that, is Pennsylvania. But really awesome. Thank you, California. Super excited that the state that I live in is number 1. And yeah, I think that's it. I guess that's it for statistics that I can share that I can see right now. Thank you for taking the time to listen to From the Honeycomb podcast, the 3-year anniversary podcast episode. I hope you found this a little insightful, gave you a little behind the scenes, shared a little bit of what is to come. Like I said, I'm starting to really think about where I want the podcast to go. I'm having so much fun with it. Yeah, but I felt like I had a little bit of burnout just trying to get a good episode to you every single week. And I'm really wanting to focus on quality over quantity. So that's, I guess, the one little giveaway I can give on what to expect with the future of the podcast. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If you listen every week, I am so, so grateful. And if you're new to the podcast, welcome. I think this is kind of the episode to start with because now you know a little bit about the podcast, where it's come from. And because I realized there is an intro episode that first came out when the very first podcast episode aired about the podcast, but so much has changed and evolved and shifted. I don't know if I need to like re-record that or something, maybe do like a reintroduction, but I feel like this is like a yearly check-in just so you know, like, okay, what am I letting go of and what am I bringing in for the podcast? And I think the intro as well speaks for itself. So I hope you like the new intro. I hope you like the new ending. Be sure to listen all the way through. And yeah, thank you all so much for your support. You listening makes this podcast possible. And just, yeah, like, subscribe, just share with your friends. Follow me on social media at From the Honeycomb Podcast. I'm also kind of restructuring what I want to do with my Instagram account, so you can follow me there. I like to share kind of behind the scenes of having an architecture business, what that's like. And if you're thinking about starting your own architecture firm, definitely follow me. I give some tips and tricks and kind of advice on what worked for me, and also want to be, as transparent as possible with what it's like having your own architecture firm, because I know when I was starting out, there's so many people I reached out to and I was so, interested on how does it work, so curious about it. And it was through other people that I learned. So I hope to now give back and share about my experience. So that's what you can expect from me on From the Honeycomb on Instagram. So it's at From the Honeycomb Podcast. And thank you all so much for listening and tuning in every week. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of From the Honeycomb Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to rate, review, and share it with your friends. To stay connected, follow me on Instagram at From the Honeycomb Podcast, and you can support the podcast through the Patreon link in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to my monthly newsletter, where I share exclusive behind-the-scene content and tips on running a mindful and successful architecture business. Thank you again for listening, and stay curious.